big issue to us. And we just finished our run last year, but very likely, people are saying that, our next one, our year, 5 years from now, we will very likely using the current UK model, that the one they just went through. So I think it would be really good for Jill to really share with us, her insights on, how to become successful, in the RE exercise. Particularly, I mean, the competition is not among ourselves. The competition is more the whole university with other academic department too. So I really hope that the social work department is not really good, among our respective universities. So without any delay, I pass the microphone to Jill.
Great. Thank you, Terry, and hello everybody. It's an absolute delight to be here on this really important occasion. And the last thing I should be talking about is something like the REF, because that is not inspiring and it is a lot of work, and we should talk more about social work education, which is having a hard time in England at the moment. I don't know if you've noticed that, but there are chill winds blowing across England about the future of social work education. So don't learn from us on many things. Please don't learn from us. We have a lot of criticism of social work education. We have a lot of let's get it out of the universities, back to employers, and really some doubts about whether or not we've been doing a good job, which is really not very good news, is it? Particularly, I've been working in social work education for mainstreaming for about 20 years now, and I don't think people know that my daughter is training to be a social worker at the moment, so I've got a very financial stake in the future of social work education at the moment, and I keep an eye on what she's doing. But I'm going to just briefly mention about what we call the research exercise framework. We try and change the initials each time so we remember where we are. This is not the RAE, it's now REF, and thinking about social work and how it's done and what we think about it all, because it's a new game in town, really, for many people. So this is what happened. Our REF results came out just before Christmas, and this is what happened in the UK overall. 154 universities took part, nearly 2,000 submissions, 52,000 staff, 191,000 research outputs, and our new impact case studies, there were nearly 7,000 of those. So my goodness, what a lot of paper, what a lot of reading that was. And we had panels, 36 panels, which were overseen by 4 main ones. So one of the jobs, I suppose, in thinking about it is who does social work want to be on panels for the future, and how to support people in that way. I supported my friend and colleague, who was a member of the social work panel, by giving her lots of cups of tea and sympathising as she wheeled suitcases up and down England with things to read time and time again. And I have to say, she sometimes said that she really regretted the number of people who sent in books as their output, because those were very heavy to wheel up and down England in her suitcase. But she got a lot of different sorts of output, books, articles, sometimes practice development documents, and they had to read and digest all these and then make judgments. They spent a lot of weekends in hotels in which they discussed very hard work. It sounds nice being in a hotel for the weekend, but they got up early and went to bed late and had to go through all the outputs and impact case studies. So hard work, and colleagues need support from their institution, from their team colleagues, and from the collegiate world of social work to take part in this. It means you can't do your day job as teaching, as marking, as being head of department. It makes it very hard for you to produce research reports and proposals if you've got that amount of work to be done. But it was done. So, just to say, I'm not here to sell the REF, and indeed one of the things I think has been a very welcome publication recently has been a book by a very well-known academic from the University of Lancaster, so that's a good university, he's a very respected academic, talking about the intellectual criticisms of the REF. And he says, basically just to sum it up, that it was a story of gaming, making games and trading off and that sort of thing, and intrigue, so lots of skullduggery going on. It was a waste of money, he says. We could have spent more money better wisely. And actually it's intellectually doubtful. that we pretend it's intellectually rigorous, but really it depended on people reading, skim reading, very quickly reading materials, not knowing much about the subject, and just sort of looking at it. And that, I think, is a really important thing to bear in mind. Social work is a critical profession, if nothing else, critical of itself, critical of others, and needs to maintain perhaps that healthy scepticism around. But the big thing, the big game in town on our last ref was the focus on impact, which people in social sciences were delighted about. Because one thing people in social sciences do is that they talk to policymakers, they talk to practitioners. And the way we have defined impact is impact exists where at the university door, or on the doorstep. What you do outside the university or the college is impact inside its academic debate. And that's been our rough game. But for those of us working in social work, that's great, isn't it? Because all of our students go out, all of our publications are directed to telling practitioners and managers and politicians what to do. We do toolkits, we do practice guides, just by a matter of course. So actually we were well prepared. If you worked in an esoteric subject, perhaps you only talk to fellow historians or Greek civilization experts. You don't get. So we have a lot of people on television now doing lots of impact about history and art and so on, who never used to be there. But for social work, that was great. It went with the grain of our profession, and we found it more important, though, to collect evidence. And that was our big challenge. We knew we made a difference. How do we collect the evidence? So most of the time, we asked people. We were very assertive and saying, I have spent 3 weeks writing this document for you. Please send me a letter saying this was the most wonderful thing you've ever read. Or at least really important. And we have been assertive in asking for feedback, not waiting for people to tell us that it was nice, and getting it down on paper or email, not word of mouth, because that doesn't appear. So we have collected information on impact very rigorously, really. We have put people in charge of it. We have said this is where it's going to be kept, this is how it's going to be electronically safe, and so on, just to make sure we've got that impact. Because I have a mind which is like a goldfish. I go around and I've forgotten what I've done, so I need to have that impact, particularly if it's 5 years ago, where I can't remember what I was doing 5 years ago, and really making sure that people do it, and if they haven't got it, they go back and get it. And that's a little bit difficult, and particularly I think for women, and there is a gendered bit in that about saying for women, be more assertive, but don't wait for people to come and tell you you've made impact. Ask people how they've used it, ask people to cite your documents and so on. So that was important. We've captured the social, political and cultural impact of social work in a number of dimensions, and there are examples that you can read that are free, electronically available, and I've got a link to them here. We've thought about what methods people were using. In social work, it's always traditionally been interviews and focus groups and a few surveys. We know from people's reports of the REF that social work has expanded its methodological repertoire, particularly by teaming up with other professionals within academia. It's been able to get part of surveys, it's been able to talk about implementation science, and that's been really useful. And then, of course, there is the doubt, does impact matter? You know, is it really something that you can measure? And we've had to debate that time and time again. Is it just a matter of obeying your funder's instructions? Does it really matter to the end user or family carer? So we still debate those subjects. This REF had the first use of case studies. And when you don't want to work in a university social work department anymore, you can set up a lovely career being the author of case studies and sell yourself to institutions how to create a good case study. I came across numbers of people who I'd never heard of who claimed that they were the experts on case studies and could help poor, struggling universities produce these. Sometimes it was what we call snake oil. It didn't work, and they were trying to sell themselves to be experts that they were not. Other times, I think they were very good, and they could interrogate academics and say, but what do you mean by this? How do you know it worked? And they were quite forensic in able to getting people to do this. This is the first analysis by my colleague at King's called Jonathan Grant, who was commissioned to do a very rapid piece of work on all of the case studies. And they did bibliometrics, they did word searching, they did deep dives in some area. If you have a holiday in which you have nothing to do, you can take this with you. But they also produced the searchable database. I have tried to search it for social work, and of course social work doesn't come up as one area. You get a lot of case studies about work and a lot of things about social, which might be, you know, social parties or social groups. So it's quite difficult. But if you work at it, you can spot the social work ones and the universities who said what they did in relation to social work. And that is worth doing. It's quite hard to mine, but it is worth doing and seeing what a case study looks like if Hong Kong chooses to do that case study approach, how they polished these. All over England, in the run-up to the REF, people were organising events and parliamentary receptions and important signs of impact. The way in which Jonathan and his colleagues looked at was to say that parliamentary evidence was very good signs of impact. And actually they were very surprised to find that large numbers of people did have quite close connections with parliamentarians and parliamentary groups. I think there was this idea that universities were in an ivory tower or silo and they just produced articles that only their colleagues read. But actually, they've often been people who know where it is. And you know that as well as I do, that sometimes we're the only people who can remember what happened 5-10 years ago, because civil servants move on, don't they, very quickly, particularly in England. So just about social work, lots of positive reactions. Everybody claims to have done well in the REF, so that's good. They have been able to argue to universities that most of them have done well compared to the size and scale of the investment in them. There isn't much money in social work research, so they don't score very well on the metric, which is about how much money you bring into the university, as if you were, in contrast, for example, who's somebody who does work on infectious diseases, whereby they get millions of pounds. But sometimes social work is married up to people who've got the money, particularly in dementia, and I'm very guilty of that, marrying up with people who've got big clinical grants and saying, what about the social? What about families? We can do that. So that's been very helpful. And some people have got very large amounts of money in social work research over the years. The impact has been evident. As I've said, the people who were the REF social work academics on the panels have said that they did find consistent evidence that people influence policy, that they influence practice. If you work in children's services, you would know perhaps of the work of Eileen Monroe, who's been very influential in how do we think about making decisions in relation to child protection and child abuse. Theory, people have talked about theories, different models of change that have been around social work and have said that they've been important. And of course social work has a lot of influence on education and training, about problem-solving techniques, problem-based learning, different models of assessment, different sort of labs and so on. We can do that. Social work was combined in the UK with social policy. So when you look at the scores of that particular panel, you say, oh, Oxford is top. But Oxford doesn't have a course in social work, so actually it was the social policy people who won it for the University of Oxford. But that's great, nobody minds too much about that at all. York did very well. York has a very, very strong social policy programme and an increasingly strong social work department, and together they were a hard act to follow. The LSE did well in social policy, but it doesn't run a social work course. So it was social policy. So it's all that little detail that you might think of important to read and which will be reflected in your localities. What we probably have paid less attention to is the scores given to environment, which impact was seen as new. It was big in proportion, as well as outputs, that's the journals articles. But there was also quite an amount of weight given to environment, which is hard to measure, isn't it? What do we mean by environment? Do we mean beautiful buildings? You would do well here. Do we mean there's a lot going on? How do you measure environment? And that was vaguely around the notion that you would display vitality in your social work department. that it would be doing this, organising that, setting this up, responding to this, all quite difficult to do when you've got to manage the day job of running a professional education course. But vitality is an important measure, and how do we conceptualise vitality? And then lastly, the other element of that is sustainability, which in a sense became the notion that you would have PhD students, that you would engage with developing a new generation of academics, and being quite clear that that wasn't going to happen by accident, but you had a strategic approach to developing the younger generations, or to develop, bringing in new blood into the department, or having been sustainable because you had new links with nursing or whoever it is you're linking up with. So important to think about, and very hard, of course, to do the week before your submission. And all this is quite a lot of planning. We've just been at a session talking about advanced care planning. It's much the same here as advanced ref planning. The other things that were highly featured was that those departments did well that had international connectivity. So people wrote in international journals, people played their part in international debates, and of course here, being the association, you have immediately scored a tick in your submission of being engaged internationally with the discipline. So but collecting that information and thinking about it, keeping it going is important. Then lastly, what we have seen is more cautionary, the growing tendency in some social work departments for people to be researchers and for other people to do the teaching. And some people would like to do both. And some people see that teachers are have less status than researchers, who get money, who get recognition, and really trying to balance that out. How do we support the people who are teaching, who are looking after problem students? I'm sure you don't have problem students here, but my goodness, I've had problem students, and they take an enormous amount of energy, don't they? And mean somebody has to do that really valuable task, as well as being the superstars in terms of research. So really thinking about what way do you want to go in terms of being a teaching group of staff and a research group. How do you want people perhaps to have combined that, whether people can move across. One day I might say, I'm fed up with research, I'm going to go back with teaching. Is it possible for me to do that? How do we enable people to do it? Big teams and big places did well. And this, I think, is a difficulty for the smaller courses, the smaller departments, to think about their own sustainability. And sometimes that's about being specialist. So we have small social work teams and departments in the UK that specialise, say, in alcohol misuse related social work with people who are blind. So maybe if you are small, it's developing that niche area. Or perhaps they're in very remote locations and they specialise in local, rural issues, but really thinking how the small can survive, as well as the big teams and the big players. Will social work research see the benefit? Yes, it will, because there is a transparent allocation in terms of funding that is extraordinarily complex to understand, but it does mean that. Of course, when social work gets the money, it doesn't go to social work, it goes to the university. And that is a big debate to have, isn't it? The money's in the university, we're here in the department. Do we ever see sight or sound of that money? And I think those are tendencies to have. I was in a university where we said, what would happen with the money? And they said, you are not going to get any. And we thought, well, why did we bother? Why did we bother doing this work? So that's a big question to ask. Was it worth it in terms of effort? I think social work in England has been very positive, really. It was pleased with what it did. It thought impact was great, and it has, at a time of difficulty, at least got something that it can say we are doing well, and that has been very helpful to us. So I'm going to end there, but delighted to answer questions, but I'm also delighted to answer questions on anything else. Thank you.
So thank you, Jill. Oh, I know we don't have much time, so and also we are going to have lunch with some of you. So why don't we, particularly for people who are not going to lunch, I think this will be your opportunity to ask questions, right? So let me open up the forum for further speech.
Can you tell us more about the outcomes of the REF framework. Now, like in Hong Kong, we follow the British model.
Yes.
And then we have like one reading, internationally excellent. And how about for the RE? Yeah. You have kind of classification.
Exactly the same, yes.
Exactly the
Yeah,
same.
almost exactly
They
the
just
same.
follow the previous RE exercise.
With I mean, the devil is in the detail, as we say, so you have to read where that is and where the thresholds will be. So I think in any new variation, it is finding the person who is a very meticulous, detailed person who can translate what that means, because they do like to change. And there will be reviews of the past REF in the UK to say, were the thresholds too high, too low? Should we not? Should we concentrate? Were there too many that were internationally superstar articles? Is that a too low threshold, and we need to move it up? So debates will happen there, and those generally in the RE processes are academic, but they also have research councils, they have end users, they have people from government on, so it's a consensus about the direction that they want to travel.
But how did they kind of operationalize, like well-reading in terms of impact?
Well, they went by a series of instructions how they would classify that. For the first time, it wasn't based on which journal your article was in. So if your article was in Nature, or your article was in the Hong Kong Journal of Very Small Social Work, or whatever it would be, it was the quality of the article that meant. Of course, if it was in Nature, you probably did quite well, but it wasn't to do with that. And that has helped, I think, people be desperate about getting things into certain journals. And other journals it's been fine to publish in journals with less impact factor. Impact factor in UK social worker is very, very low. Very low. We find it very difficult to get into the American literature, because we spend the first 3,000 words of any article telling people that the system is different, otherwise the referees don't understand it. So we are very parochial in our publications. We publish for British social work in generally British social work material, or that diaspora about. But the panel said, we are not going to look at the journal, we will look at the content. And that was very helpful, I think, for a lot of people. Save that desperation of going, searching for the perfect journal.
Sure. As we know, social work is an international profession with local practice. But it seems that in the RAE or REF exercise, they rank internationally higher than local research outcome. For us, by no means we should produce all the research outcomes are international. So how do you deal with this issue in the UK?
I think that we are mainly local, but there was the panel were appreciative not only of outputs being international, but also that the engagement and the impact was international. So Eileen Monroe, if I take her as a case example, her research is about UK social work, but she has worked with people in Australia and other parts in signs of safety. Do you have that here? It's a very fashionable thing at the moment. And would develop an international dimension to the research without necessarily publishing, and she's not published a great deal, but she's done very influential small number of publications with no international collaborations or anything like that, but making sure that the impact had an international dimension. And that's been, that I think was valued and is seen as valuable in terms of the global reach of the research, and being internationally credible is very important in that respect.
Jill, thank you very much. I think a good thing is for the RDF it's moving from only journal publication and also consider case study. And I can see that what you have mentioned is the emphasis is more on in order to prepare for that, we also have to make it very explicit, for our impact. So how can we document, this kind of, to document the impact that we have, for example, a case study or a journal What you have said that we can have responses from for example, from NGO, saying that they're adopting your application, something like that. So full email, full letter, or full, what kind of, do they have a standard format?
No, you need to evidence, and there was audit done of some of the case studies to prove when you said this has happened, that it actually did. But people provided in the case studies, which were proportional. Not everybody did a case study, it was per unit of submission. And the universities went through the case studies with a very fine tooth comb to see which they would do and which they wouldn't. But I think what was for social work was actually to create a variety of case studies and see which stood the test of time. And we have to be prepared for the unexpected. I've had pieces of work that I thought had no impact whatsoever, and all of a sudden somebody's used it. I didn't know they were using it, they never told me. So you do, but I think now we are conscious about trying to track that through electronic means. Google Scholar, if I'm allowed to say Google, is really helpful, isn't it? Telling you what things you've forgotten about. Capturing all that is really good. And being out, I think, and that's a tension, isn't it? Your students need you to be in, to answer their queries, to answer their stress and distress. Finance needs you to be in, everybody needs you to be in, but the dilemma is you need to be out. And out meeting people, out at meetings, out at conferences, having with a sort of instrumental role, as well as presenting your work, telling people about your work, and so on. So much juggling going on. But of course, if you're in social work, juggling is what you do, isn't it? It is keeping many balls in the air and trying not to let too many of them drop. And of course, being collegiate. And this is not an area for prima donnas. This is an area in which you have to be sure that your colleague will tell people about your work, and you will tell people about your colleague's work. And that's about departments being really keen, and actually as a profession telling people that social work can do this, because if social work doesn't defend itself, nobody else will. So being say, well, social work does a lot of work on expressed emotion or palliative care. Do you know that? Yeah. Even if it's not your own university. So it's building up trust with each other, and also the people who are not going to be research entered for the research, really making sure that they're valued, because they are the people there on Friday afternoon when your student is in distress, and when your PhD student is having family problems or something like that. So keeping that balance going is important. And then for heads of department, it's about also defending your colleagues, I think, from the perennial, ever-going request for information from the central university. I'm sure that doesn't happen here, does it? But time and time again, can you tell us how many people came to this? Can you tell us the number of this? Can you tell us that? And defending your colleagues, because they cannot supply information daily, otherwise they can't do their work. So it's really one piece of information, many uses, and being quite slick about that. And supporting your administrators, who are the ones who know, don't they? They know they should have on and see the usefulness of information. So lots to think about in that way. So it's like being a social worker.
Do we have questions at this time? So we have quite a few questions at this time. No. Because of time, should we end right now here for those who go to the lunch? We can have more informal sharing after that. So why don't you give a big hand to Jill for
I would just like to say some words of appreciation. First of all, I have to thank Jill for the wonderful and stimulating presentation. I think you have